The sharp crack of branches and a guttural growl shattered the morning silence. The sound, muffled and piercing, came from the depths of the forest, causing young Ranger Jack Carter to stop in his tracks. He felt a chill run down his spine, and his heart, as if forgetting its rhythm, pounded in his chest. Whatever it was, he knew for sure. You wouldn't hear such a thing on an ordinary day, even in the wildest corner of Sierra Nevada National Park. Placing his foot on the next root, he slowly moved forward, carefully, trying not to make a sound. Each of his steps dragged questions behind it, but there were no answers. The sun was just beginning to rise over the forest, bathing the tops of ancient pines with soft gold. The morning air was clean and fresh, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Life here flowed at its own unhurried pace, as if time had stopped. Birds flitted between the trees, their melodious trills echoing with the distant chatter of a squirrel, skillfully jumping from branch to branch. For Jack, this was not just a place of work, but a refuge where he felt part of something bigger. The forest, alive and mighty, always gave him comfort and peace. But today it seemed as if nature itself was warning him of danger. As he approached the clearing, the sound subsided, and then Jack saw it. At the very edge of the sunlit spot, by a huge pine tree, lay a grizzly bear. The enormous animal, a symbol of this reserve, seemed to be trapped in its own nightmare. Its powerful paws were entangled in barbed wire, and a steel noose hung around its neck, digging into the flesh. Blood was everywhere, red spots spread on the grass, like wounds of the forest. The bear breathed heavily, its guttural growl interspersed with wheezing. Jack froze, stunned by what he saw. He felt as if time had stopped, and the air around him had become thick as syrup. Who could do such a thing, he murmured almost inaudibly, surveying the scene. Just yesterday, this clearing seemed to him a peaceful corner where tranquility and harmony reigned. Now, however, a scene of cruelty and pain unfolded before him. Jack knew how dangerous grizzly bears could be, but he also realized that leaving the animal in such a state meant betraying everything he believed was right. His gaze met the eyes of the beast, full of fear and pleading. That was the moment when doubts were no more. Jack took a deep breath, restraining the trembling in his hands, and slowly reached for the radio, knowing that every action from now on would be not only a fight for the life of this bear, but also a step against those who turned the forest into a death trap. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, as if rooted to the spot. His breathing quickened, and his hands involuntarily clenched into fists. The enormous grizzly bear lying before him was a symbol of strength, but now it looked broken, crushed by pain and helplessness. Each of its jerks, each heavy breath reminded him of the suffering inflicted by humans. And yet, despite the pain, the beast still held a threatening power. Jack knew that one wrong move could end in tragedy. Leave him, reasoned his mind. In every ranger briefing, they warned, approaching an injured wild animal is pure madness. But his heart said otherwise. Looking into the bear's eyes, Jack saw not a threat, but a plea for help that pierced him to the core. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling, and began to approach cautiously. Each step echoed in his head. The bear growled hoarsely, tried to lunge, but the wire only dug deeper into its flesh. Jack froze, raising his hands. "Easy, buddy. Easy. I won't hurt you." His voice was barely audible, as if he was afraid to disturb the fragile balance between life and death. The bear stopped struggling, only watching Jack warily, breathing heavily. As if sensing that the human was not an enemy, the animal relaxed for a moment. Jack slowly knelt down, trying to keep a distance that could still save his life. He took off his backpack, pulled out a knife and a rope. Each movement was calculated, like a surgeon performing a complex operation. The wire wrapped around the bear's paws and neck was so tight that it had to be cut carefully to avoid causing the animal even more pain. Jack started with the most dangerous one, the one around the neck. "Hang in there," he whispered, feeling the sweat sting his eyes. "We'll make it." The bear exhaled loudly when the noose loosened. This was the first step to freedom, but Jack knew there was still much to do. The animal froze again, clearly sensing that the human was working to save it. Each touch of the knife to the wire sent a shiver through his hands. One wrong move, and everything would go wrong. But Jack continued. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the trap on the paw was opened. The bulky metal mechanism fell to the ground, leaving deep wounds behind. The bear did not move. Its body, exhausted by pain and blood loss, barely held on. Jack wanted to believe that the animal understood. He was not an enemy. He reached for the radio again. "This is Carter. Send the veterinary team, urgently. We have an injured bear." "Repeat. Injured bear. He's on the brink." The response came quickly, but each minute of waiting stretched into eternity. Jack sat on the grass next to the enormous beast. He could not take his eyes off the wounds tearing the bear's flesh. It seemed to him that his own heart began to ache just like the animal's body. "Just hang in there, buddy," he said softly, not knowing if the bear could hear him. "We'll get you out of here. Just hold on." When the sound of the approaching helicopter cut through the silence, Jack felt the tension that had gripped his body ease slightly. The bear, hearing the noise, jerked but could not even lift its head. Jack reached out his hand, touched its furry side, and said in a whisper, "It's going to be okay. I promise." At that moment, he realized that he was not just saving the bear, but also giving a promise to himself. The sound of the helicopter faded into the distant hills, leaving behind only the rustle of the wind in the treetops. Jack stood on the clearing where a drama had recently unfolded. The bear's wounds would remain in his memory for a long time, but an even stronger impression was left by another image: the traps, wire nooses, and blood on the grass. All this was the work of human hands, whose cruelty contradicted the very essence of these places. Sierra Nevada was created to preserve wild nature, but someone had turned it into an arena of death. Jack slowly looked around. Every detail on this clearing now seemed to him a key to the mystery. The horrifying scene could not have been an accident. He found more traces, deep boot prints, pieces of torn cloth caught on thorn bushes. These clues seemed to tell him, "Follow our trail, if you dare." Returning to the station, he immediately went to the senior ranger, Bill Harris, to report what had happened. Bill, an experienced and rough man, had long worked in the park and seen a lot. He listened to Jack intently, occasionally nodding. "This is the fourth case in the last month," Bill said, looking out the window. "All the traps are the same, the work of professionals. We think it's a group of poachers. They hunt large predators, bears, cougars, wolves. Skins, meat, and just the adrenaline. Only there's no evidence yet." Bill's words hit Jack like a blow to the head. The fourth case? And no one had stopped them earlier? "We're just waiting," he blurted out. Bill shrugged. "We do what we can, kid. But catching them red-handed is not as easy as it seems. The forest is huge, and we have few people. We set up cameras, traps too, but so far it's all in vain." Jack did not argue, but inside him, anger boiled. Every trap, every maimed animal paw seemed to him a personal insult. He vowed not to let it go just like that. The next day, he started taking action. Jack armed himself with a map, GPS, and several surveillance cameras. He chose places where the poachers' traces seemed most likely: hidden trails, secluded water bodies, dense thickets. Each step in the forest was a step into enemy territory, but he did not let fear take over. After a few days, he managed to find a hideout. It was an old, abandoned hunting shelter hidden between the rocks. Inside, signs of recent presence: empty cans, pieces of rope, even a map covered in markings. Everything indicated that the poachers were using this place as a base. Jack stood for a long time in the dim light of the shelter, clenching his fists. This place had become a symbol of what he was fighting against. He photographed everything he could and returned to the station. At that moment, he realized that his work had long gone beyond mere patrolling. Now, it was a personal mission. At dusk, he returned to his cabin. The forest outside the window seemed peaceful, but now Jack saw in it not only beauty. He saw the wounds inflicted by people and the scars that would leave their marks for a long time. He had to take the next step, and he knew it would not be easy. Early morning enveloped the forest in a silvery mist, through which the first rays of the sun barely penetrated. The wind rustled the tops of the pines, but below, under the dense canopy, silence reigned. Jack sat on a wooden bench by the rehabilitation center, looking towards the cage where the bear was. The grizzly, now named Titan, lay curled up, its massive body rising and falling in the rhythm of restless sleep. Since the bear had been brought here, several days had passed. Veterinarians fought for its life, suturing wounds and treating them, trying to prevent infection. Titan turned out to be strong, but Jack knew that the animal's survival was only part of the matter. The bond that had formed between them on that clearing seemed to demand more. He felt obligated not only to save the bear, but also to return its freedom. A faint wheeze pulled him out of his thoughts. The bear opened its eyes and looked straight at Jack. Titan's brown eyes were filled with a mixture of fatigue and something else. Perhaps it was trust. Jack approached the cage, slowly and carefully, as if afraid to scare away the invisible thread that connected them. "You'll get better, buddy," he said softly, squatting by the bars. "We'll get you out of here. Just a little more time." The bear barely moved its head, and Jack caught the movement of its nose. The animal was sniffing the air, as if trying to understand who was in front of it. Jack smiled. There was something childlike about it, despite the enormous size of the beast. Every day he came here, sat next to the cage, and told Titan about his plans. About how they would find those who set the traps. About how the bear would be free again. Sometimes it seemed that Titan understood him, although perhaps it was just his imagination. One evening, when the veterinarians had already left, Jack decided to take a risk. He opened a small door in the cage and carefully entered. Titan raised its head, and in its gaze, there was again something wary, but not threatening. Jack slowly extended his hand, leaving it at arm's length. "You can trust me," he said softly, looking straight into the animal's eyes. For a moment, the bear froze, and then slowly leaned towards his hand and inhaled, sniffing. This was a sign. Not certainty, but not refusal either. Jack felt a warm surge in his chest. The bond between them was strengthening. Weeks passed. Titan began to stand up, move, although each attempt cost him dearly. Jack watched the progress, but his thoughts increasingly returned to what had caused these wounds. Another ranger, Tom, told him that the poachers had become smarter. They used traps with minimal traces, disguising their snares so that they were almost impossible to notice. Jack understood. He could not just wait. The final straw was the news that another bear had been found dead deep in the forest. Jack felt a surge of anger. He returned to the center to see Titan again, who was now standing on all fours. Their gazes met, and Jack said softly, "We'll make it. I'll do everything to stop them." Titan seemed to understand him. Slowly turning, the bear lay down, but its eyes did not close. It looked at Jack as if saying, "I trust you." The forest greeted the night darkness as if putting on a mask. Stars scattered across the sky barely pierced the dense canopy of pines. Jack stood by his car, checking his backpack. Surveillance cameras, binoculars, flashlight, everything was in place. But his heart beat with alarm, as if sensing that this night everything would change. Over the past few days, cameras set up along hidden trails had begun to detect strange movements. Barely noticeable silhouettes, flashes of light among the trees. These were not tourists and not animals. Jack was sure. The poachers were on the hunt again. He stepped into the darkness, leaving the car on the side of the road. The flashlight beam pierced the thick gloom, revealing bushes, roots, and the shimmering gleam of dewdrops. Jack walked slowly, as if afraid that each of his steps would awaken the forest. His own breathing seemed too loud, and the crackling of twigs under his feet sounded like thunder. On one of the camera screens, an alarm signal went off. Jack stopped, took out a tablet, and opened the live image. In the frame, a faint flashlight beam flickered, interspersed with the shadow of a person. A stranger, bent over, was fiddling with something on the ground. "Got you," Jack whispered. He moved forward, trying to step as quietly as possible. The distance between him and the poacher decreased, but the forest seemed like an endless labyrinth. Finally, he came out onto a small clearing. At its edge stood a man bent over something that Jack instantly recognized. A trap. His heart pounded so hard that he thought for a moment that they would hear it. "Stop!" Jack shouted, stepping out of the shadows. His voice echoed through the forest. The poacher abruptly turned around, his face frozen in fear for a moment, but then he took off running. Jack rushed after him, feeling his legs carry him forward, as if they themselves understood that this person could not be allowed to escape. The forest filled with the sounds of the chase, the crackling of branches, heavy breathing, distant footsteps. The fugitive raced, diving into the thick darkness, but Jack was faster. He almost caught up with him when the man suddenly turned sharply, causing Jack to crash into a low branch. For a moment, everything spun around him, but he rushed forward again. Now there were only a few steps between them. On a small clearing, surrounded by a dense wall of trees, the poacher stumbled and fell. Jack, not wasting a second, jumped on top of him. They both rolled on the ground, but Jack was stronger. He pinned the fugitive's arms behind his back, breathing heavily, as if he had just climbed to the top of a mountain. "That's it, you're caught," he gasped, pulling out the radio. The poacher was silent, but his eyes burned with anger. Jack turned on the radio and transmitted the coordinates. The voice on the other end assured him that backup was already on the way. As he waited, the forest around seemed to freeze. Even the wind died down, leaving them alone among the silent trees. Jack looked at the poacher and felt anger surging in his chest. This man might have been involved in Titan's suffering, in the death of other animals. "Do you know what you've done?" Jack asked softly. "How much blood has been shed because of people like you?" Silence was his answer, but Jack was not looking for words. Justice was important to him. The headlights cut through the darkness, and a minute later, the poacher was under guard. When it was all over, Jack returned to the car. Fatigue suddenly overwhelmed him, as if someone had pulled all the energy out of him. He slumped into the driver's seat and closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the night forest. Now, knowing that at least one of those who had turned his beloved forest into an arena of death could no longer harm, he felt a strange relief. But he also understood this was only the beginning. The sky was tinged with pre-dawn shades of pink and gray when Jack returned to the rehabilitation center. The air was cool, and the first rays of the sun played on the dew-covered leaves. The center was still asleep, and only the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path disturbed the silence. Over the past weeks, this place had become his second home, and the cage where Titan was reminded him of his main goal. The bear, noticing Jack, raised its head. Titan looked significantly better. His wounds had healed, his gait was more confident, and his eyes radiated that strength associated with grizzlies. Jack approached closer, squatted in front of the cage, and spoke. "Today is the day, buddy," he said softly. "Time to go home." The veterinarians confirmed that Titan was ready for release. His physical condition had recovered, and now he could return to the wild where he belonged. But Jack could not shake off the anxiety. The grizzly, who had become more than just an animal to him, had to leave, leaving emptiness behind. The veterinarians conducted the final examinations, secured the GPS collar, and prepared Titan for transport. When they loaded him into the cage on a special van, the bear growled softly, but no longer with threat, but rather with displeasure. Jack smiled. "I wouldn't want to ride in something like that either," he muttered. The van started moving, and Jack sat next to the driver. The road to the reserve zone was long and winding. The forest around changed from rocks to trees again until they reached a deep gorge where wild nature reigned supreme. There were no trails here, no hint of human presence, only the ancient forest stretching to the horizon. When they opened the cage, Titan did not move for a long time. He looked at the exit and then turned his head to Jack. Their gazes met, and time seemed to freeze. Jack felt something inside him tearing apart. This was the moment of farewell, which he both awaited and feared. "Go, buddy," he whispered. "You're free." The bear cautiously stuck out his nose, inhaling the air. Then, gathering his strength, he took a step, another, and finally found himself outside. His enormous figure, so menacing and majestic, dissolved into the forest thicket. Jack stood motionless until the brown silhouette disappeared completely. But before leaving, Titan turned again. He looked at Jack, long and intently, as if trying to say something. In that gaze was gratitude, understanding, and something more that did not require words. Jack nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. When Titan disappeared, the forest filled with sounds again. The chirping of birds, the rustling of the wind. But for Jack, this place would never be the same again. He felt that Titan had left a mark in his life that would stay with him forever. Jack returned to the van without looking back. He still had much to do. The poachers they had caught were only the tip of the iceberg. The forest needed protection, and he was ready to devote his life to it. But at that moment, when the first rays of the sun pierced the fog, Jack felt for the first time in a long time that he had done something truly right. He got into the car, looked at the dense forest, and said softly, "Thank you, Titan. We are both free." The forest was awakening. Morning dew sparkled on the grass, and a light breeze rustled the treetops. Jack sat on a high rock from which he could see the vast expanses of Sierra Nevada. He looked into the distance, where the forest gradually merged with the horizon, and tried to comprehend everything that had happened over the past weeks. Titan was free. The grizzly, who had survived human cruelty, had once again become part of his world. Jack knew that the bear, despite all the trials, would find his place in this wild realm. This thought warmed him, but at the same time left a strange feeling of emptiness. The bond he felt with the bear was unique, and now that it was over, he felt different. From behind came footsteps. It was Bill Harris, the senior ranger. He silently approached, sat down, and for a while just looked at the same panorama. "Good job, Jack," Bill finally said. "We checked the information from the caught poacher. Turns out it's a whole network. We'll all have to work hard to stop them." Jack nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the forest. "I know," he replied softly. "I'm ready. They've taken too much from this place." Bill paused for a second, then patted Jack on the shoulder. "Don't forget, kid, you've done more than most. Titan is alive thanks to you, and that means more than you can imagine." Jack looked at him and smiled slightly. He knew Bill was right, but that was only part of the story. For him, the forest had become something more than just a place of work. Now he felt like a part of it, a protector, a voice that would speak for those who could not. The sun rose higher, flooding the forest with warm light. Jack stood up and reached out to the horizon. "Look at this, Bill. This is what we fight for." The senior ranger smiled and also stood up. "Yes, kid, and it's our job to keep this world the way it is." They descended from the summit, leaving behind a view that would remain in their memory. Jack knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but now he felt calm from doing everything he could to protect those who needed it. The forest had accepted him, and he had accepted the forest. And somewhere deep in the thicket, unseen and free, Titan walked on his land, not looking back.